You know, you all do not have the privilege of seeing yourselves the way we up here see you. It's the most beautiful thing. And if this were Temple University, if this were Temple University, we could say that Temple University would represent the future. But since you are not Temple University, but you know, Lewis does something that's very DuBoisian. You know, Du Bois studied philosophy at Fisk and at Harvard, and he says that he studied Hegel and he studied Kant, and he went to Germany, and I'm certain he was inundated with German philosophy. Germany is the center of European modern philosophy. The greatest modern European philosophers, in a certain sense, the greatest world philosophers in the modern epoch, had been German. But Du Bois was told that he couldn't make a living with philosophy, and so he thought about it. He loved philosophy, but he also loved the study of social problems, and he loved the study of history. So he thought about combining philosophy with history to produce something that he would call sociology. And he would write later on that sociology was hesitant and sociology was impoverished. Well, I think what Lewis does is very Du Boisian, because what he does, I think, is combine philosophy with history to do social analysis and social studies, which means then that we have, and perhaps had come to the end of philosophy a long time ago. And the only way we can resurrect philosophy is to combine it with the life of struggle, combine it with the study of life, of human beings. As Lewis said, human social relationships. Well, that's Du Bois. And Du Bois is, in fact, and should be understood as a great philosopher. Not in the old style, but in what we could call the Du Boisian style, but it is also the 20th and 21st century style of doing philosophy. So all lovers of philosophy, hold on to it, but do it like Du Bois did it or like Lewis does it. Now, a few weeks after Du Bois died in Ghana, I entered Lincoln University. And while I never had a course on Du Bois at Lincoln, never even read a book written by Du Bois at Lincoln University, the ghost of Du Bois was all over the place. Because we knew that not only was Du Bois dead, but he was dead and we were to keep him dead, that we were not to talk about him. Du Bois was not just a bad Negro, he was a dangerous Negro. And he was a dangerous Negro because he thought, when the ruling class and the government of the United States said that thought can be criminalized, that if you think too much and if you think too critically, you can get locked up. You can lose your job. You might have to leave the country, and if you leave the country, we're going to take your passport away and deny you your citizenship. So Du Bois lost his citizenship twice in the matter of a little more than a decade. He lost it first when the government said he was the agent of a foreign government and took his passport away and said he couldn't travel. Du Bois answered them that time saying, no, I'm not an agent of a foreign government. I'm an agent of peace. They said, well, Du Bois, you're a communist. And Du Bois said, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called communist. Is that praise for the communist or condemnation for the peacemakers? You know, he had this way of throwing their charges back at them. He was a world mind, a world intellect, and they were mere Americans. So what could they do with him? But then when he goes to Ghana at the invitation of Kwame Nkrumah, first to be honored for his life and work for the liberation of Africa, but also to take up an intellectual project that he had proposed in 1909 to produce an encyclopedia of the African world, the Encyclopedia Africana. And once again, the State Department took his passport away. And in order that he might travel, he took up Ghanaian citizenship and got a Ghanaian passport. When Du Bois dies on August 27, 1963, the world pays him homage, and I mean the world. Flags were flown at half-mast. Leaders from throughout the world sent their condolences, expressing their love and respect for W.E.B. Du Bois. The American embassy in Ghana took that day to be business as usual. While most of the embassies lowered their flags to half-mast, the United States government kept its flag fully, lifted up. They hated Du Bois. Du Bois became a topic of conversation and became a legitimate intellectual and academic discussion only after the end of the Cold War in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union, which then tells us all we need to know about the silencing of Du Bois and the silencing of his legacy. Du Bois opposed American empire. He opposed the economic system upon which American empire was built. More than that, he opposed American militarism and imperialism. In fact, in the 1940s, in a famous book on race and democracy, he argued that the United States would become a more dangerous nation than even Hitler's Germany. And I think he is prescient. But it was because I finally became acquainted with Du Bois's final autobiography known as The Soliloquy, which was published in 1968 posthumously after he'd been dead 5 years. And because there was a part in that book that talked about communism and why he became a communist and what he thought about the future of world capitalism, because of that, even though I didn't know that much about Du Bois, and I was at a black college where there were no communists, I wanted to be a communist. If it's good enough for Du Bois, well. So after graduating from college and being involved with people like Max Stanford, the Revolutionary Action Movement, I find myself gravitating more and more to the left. I eventually find the Communist Party. And it's not the Communist Party that most of us think about or know about from all of these movies and from all of the negative stuff that had been said. I found myself not in the midst of white folk, but in the midst of black people whose legacies went back to the Harlem Renaissance, the Garvey movement, the Great Depression, the struggle for the Scottsboro Boys, the Southern Negro Youth Congress, the National Negro Congress, the CIO, and so on. That was my school. That was my university. But there were white folk as well. But I saw for the first time black people leading white people. I had never seen that. And white people accepting white leadership. And it was not because the white people were so generous and paternalistic. It was because these white folk, black folk, were so great. Believe me, these were the sons and daughters, the direct mentees of W.E.B. Du Bois. I didn't know it at the time. William L. Patterson, Louise Thompson Patterson, James and Esther Jackson, the great Henry Winston. And they would constantly talk about Dr. DuBois. That's the way they said it. Not Dr. Du Bois, and certainly not Dr. DuBois. Dr. DuBois, I guess it was Southern, ebonicizing the name. But it was always Dr. Du Bois, Dr. Du Bois. He had had this enormous impact upon them. So much so that after the Communist Party had gone through a sharp internal struggle in the 1940s and 1950s about where they were going and how to be a radical or left or communist party in the United States, or whether or not there should even be such a party in the United States, given that we were so democratic and the normal processes of democracy and capitalist liberalism would resolve all the problems. So some people said, you don't need that kind of party anymore. After all of that and the dust clears, even in the midst of McCarthyism and criminalization of certain speech and so on, these black thinkers come to the fore. They're now mature. They have now been all over the world. They've studied in many parts of the world, the Soviet Union, they've been to China, etc. And now they are prepared to take the work of W.E.B. Du Bois and make it the foundation of a radical, anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, pro-black, pro-working class movement in the late 20th century United States. I am of the opinion that no single individual thinker had a greater impact upon the thinking of the Communist Party after World War II, after the defeat of fascism, than did W.E.B. Du Bois. This transcends all of his academic contributions, all that the academics will now attempt to understand and in a lot of ways appropriate and distort about Du Bois. Du Bois defined for a generation what it meant to be a revolutionary. The key work that these people, kind of intellectually and politically matured on was the work Black Reconstruction in America. Du Bois calls it his magnum opus. I would agree with him, his greatest work. Du Bois had been thinking about Reconstruction all of his intellectual life, but not just Reconstruction, but the defeat of Reconstruction. And here I want to make a particular point. Reconstruction, as we heard here earlier, is that brief moment of the unfolding of democracy in the South, in the center of the most backward, racist part of the capitalist world, the slave-owning South. Out of the defeat of the planter class, this thing called Reconstruction, this political moment called Reconstruction, came into being. It is defeated, overturned after 12 years. Du Bois called it a counter-revolution, or better yet, a counter-revolution of property. I am of the opinion that he saw this counter-revolution as beginning a long period of reaction and racism in the United States. A period of reaction that lasts up to the present moment. In other words, we're talking about a 125-year period of reaction. Let me just ask you, are we all familiar with the concept political reaction? It's not like we usually say in popular discourse, don't be reactionary. In other words, don't deny yourself your agency. You act, don't just be reactionary. No, what we're talking about when we talk about political reaction, we are talking about those movements, those institutions like neoliberal capitalism, like neoconservatism, like fascism, which are against the progressive movement and unfolding of human possibility. To be reactionary is to be against humanity, is to be against freedom. A long 125-year period of reaction is what we have lived through and are living through as we speak. When Du Bois, at the end of World War II, conceived of the United States as a greater potential danger to humanity than even Hitler's Germany, he was looking back at the defeat of Reconstruction and this long period of reaction. Well, of course, there was the New Deal in the 1930s, a brief interruption. There was the civil rights movement of the 1960s, a brief interruption. But rather than democracy and liberalism, which the propaganda has convinced us of, we are living and have lived this long period of reaction, often flirting with open fascism, the carceral state, the criminal industrial system, prison industrial complex, are manifestations of this. Du Bois, therefore, how much time do I have? 2 minutes? Okay, I'll stop. No, Skipper, you don't. I'll just take 5 if you don't mind. When Du Bois writes Black Reconstruction in America, he has to rethink the world and rethink radical social thought. European thought had thought in twos, dyads, D-Y-A-D, twos, either or. Du Bois in Black Reconstruction, I think, discovers that the world that comes into existence as a result of the transatlantic slave trade and plantation slavery, i.e., the massive oppression of Africans in Africa and in the Western Hemisphere, will not be a world that will move forward basically on a dyadic worker versus capitalist, peasant versus feudal lord, slave versus slave owner. It will move forward on the basis of a triadic system. Always where the Negro, the African, is central. Indeed, as Marx had conceived things in his Communist Manifesto, there would be the struggle of worker and capitalist. And Marx was right when he looked at the English factory system and he saw the way profit and surplus value was made off of the exploitation of wage labor. And that's fine and good if you only look at the white world. But once Africa comes into it, and once the oppression of Africa is brought into the equation, you have now a third factor, which is neither capitalist nor worker in the Marxian sense, but is a proletariat. Seems kind of contradictory. It's neither capitalist nor worker. There is that class struggle, but there's always the Negro. And so I'll just draw it on the board and I'll be done. He always poses something like this. The Civil War, the North and the South were fighting or thought they were fighting. But they did not want the Negro to be free. But neither side could win without the Negro. The North, therefore, after the Emancipation Proclamation, quote, frees the slaves, but frees the slaves now to fight for their own freedom, and thus to help or to be the key factor in freeing the North. Reconstruction is this again. Okay? The 12-year period is this alliance, the Negro and the North. 5 military districts in the South, the Union Army. However, Reconstruction ends when this alliance is broken, and it is an alliance again of the North and the South against the Negro. Okay? Now, but to put things in this way is only to show the structure of these relationships. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Structure. That's a structure.
You got to bet on black, man.
Okay, bet on black. Keep it black. Okay. But what is missing here? Time. Time. Don't worry about it. I'll explain it. Time as a measure of movement. Nothing exists in a static structural state. I'll just end here. Okay, thank you. Tonight. No. I just want. No. Okay. Time. Time. Nothing exists in a static state. All human phenomena exist in time, in movement, in change. Du Bois had to account, being a historian, how these relationships would exist in time. The most, and Louis, I think we'll in philosophy and in logic, dialectics is the best form of understanding time. What does Du Bois, and so Marx took Hegel, the German philosopher's Dialectics, and applied it to capitalist economic development and to the class struggle. But what does Du Bois do? He does not apply dialectics in the twos, he applies dialectics to the triad. And I would argue, finally, that Du Bois is a great logician. He discovers a new historical logic. Maybe that logic existed throughout history. Maybe historical logic was never dyadic. Maybe Marx had it wrong. Maybe, and certainly, after the transatlantic slave trade, there is more going on than just workers and capitalists. And thus, I would say that as a logician, a philosopher of logic, and a philosopher of history, Du Bois introduces a new logic, and I call it dialectics through triads. This is his great contribution. We therefore, from a philosophical and philosophy of history standpoint, are able to understand what we were incapable of understanding in the old Diads. Those who in the radical movement, black radicals, have been trying for decades to fit race into the Marxian and Hegelian twos. Just can't never get it. So if you're black in a radical movement with white people, you're always walking around mad. Because it just doesn't fit. Because the reality is triadic, so you say, well, we're working people, we're part of the working class. Well, that's true. But the problem, as Du Bois put it, in fact, in his Black Reconstruction, he elevates the black proletariat, as he defined them, to the central place in historical transformation in the United States. Now, of course, the second chapter, he does a brief history of the white labor movement. And the white labor movement, as Du Bois saw it, never looked like the white labor movement romanticized through the lenses of white radicals who had a preconception of the direction of history. I'll stop with that. Thank you very much.